Thank you very much, Mara, and welcome back to Before Ferrante. It's always a pleasure to see so many people connected, and we thank you really for the interest with which you're following this series. We are very glad. So we are here for our third seminar of the series, entitled Becoming a Cosmopolitan Writer, Alba De Céspedes Between Italy and France. Today's session is about this incredibly interesting and prolific writer, long underrated by critics and absent from anthologies and textbooks. Writer of Italo-Cuban origins, her father was a Cuban diplomat. Alba De Céspedes grew up in Rome, married in 1926. At a young age of 15, she had a son 2 years later. After separating from her husband in 1931, she began to dedicate herself to her literary work. Nessuno, torna indietro is her first novel, dated 1938. In the first presentation of this evening by Professor Guido Bonsaver, we will delve into De Céspedes' relationship as a writer with the structures of the fascist regime. We will try to understand what were the possibilities of publication, the chances of gaining visibility for a female author during the fascist regime. After this focus on De Céspedes' early production and reception, we will follow her trajectory until the post-war period. These are years in which we witness a progressive detachment of the writer from the Italian literary field, a detachment that culminates in her move to Paris in the 60s and the publication of her last two works in French, later self-translated into Italian. It will be interesting to see what kind of view De Céspedes has of Italy from France, but also how her work is received in France during such important years in both political and cultural senses. This issue is the focus of the other two presentations of tonight, those of Sabina Ciminari and Elisa Segnini, who from two different but interrelated perspectives will concentrate precisely on De Céspedes' French years. We will therefore observe the trajectory of an authorial stance that, from its earliest public manifestations during the fascism, traverses the years of engagement and post-war, and then those of the Parisian Revolution of 1968. And as political and geographical conditions change, De Céspedes continues to express her desire to be published, to be translated, and fundamentally recognized as an author. A recognition that is both editorially and commercially, as well as culturally and symbolically significant. But I don't want to take any more time away from our guests' presentations, so let's start immediately. I'm glad to introduce our first guest, Professor Guido Bonsaver, who is a professor of Italian cultural history at the University of Oxford and a fellow of Pembroke College. His research work centers on Italy's post-unification cultural history, with a particular interest in literature and cinema. He is the author of Il mondo scritto di Italo Calvino, Elio Vittorini, Censorship and Literature in Fascist Italy, Chaos, Luigi Pirandello e i Fratelli Taviani, Vita e omicidio di Gaetano Pilati, Mussolini Censore, and his most recent publication in 2023, America in Italian Culture, The Rise of a New Model of Modernity, 1861-1943. He co-edited 5 volumes of modern Italian culture and published more than 40 essays in peer-reviewed journal and collections of essays. It's really a pleasure to have you here with us today, Professor Bonsaver. Thank you. The title of the presentation is Negotiating Literary Success in Fascist Italy. Now I leave you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carolina, and thank you to you and to Maria for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. And first of all, I should start perhaps with a confession. That is, I'm the only one probably who's here who's not an expert on the Céspedes, or better, I've been working on the Céspedes, but as part of my work on censorship that I did a few years ago, but I thought perhaps a little bit of some considerations from me on the Céspedes in that period might be useful to give you a sense of what was going on, particularly during the fascist years when she emerged as an author and deserved to be very much in the forefront of Italian literature. But as we will see, the novel in particular, Nessuno, Torna, Indietro, which Carolina mentioned, was successful, yes, but then it was somehow stifled by the regime. And the reason why the reason why we know a little bit about the history of the censorship of Nessuno, Torna, Indietro is in a way due to the fact that the Céspedes had some sort of political problems to begin with. And this is important because, by the way, when we talk about censorship, it's always difficult to kind of be able to really trace what happened, because there weren't particularly clear policies, or better, the policies developed throughout the years, but they're often not followed. There were also complex systems set up with this kind of centralization of censorship that the fascist regime developed, particularly throughout the 1930s. So a lot, in a way, happened, if you like, behind the scenes. Also because you have to bear in mind that the fascists and Mussolini himself were very proud of saying, "Oh, we don't have pre-publication censorship in fascist Italy. Anybody can publish whatever they want, But in reality, there was a system of censorship, and remember, every single book, when it came out, had to be sent in 3 copies to the Ministry of the Interior, to the local prefettura, towards the press office of the head of government, which then became the Ministry of Press and Propaganda, and eventually the Ministry of Popular Culture. And so you can imagine the amount of pressure that there was on authors and on publishing houses in particular to kind of make sure that the book was not withdrawn from circulation as soon as it came out, which was a real fear and could be a disaster for a publishing house. So that there was a huge amount of self-censorship, i.e. censorship that in a way came before the book was eventually published, and that makes it so much so difficult for us to then trace what happened, the different steps that authors and publishers took. Which is why the reconstructions of this event often implies trying to literally fish around in archives, trying to find whatever sources one can find, from correspondence to even memoirs of people who were involved on the fascist side in censorship and in publishing houses at the other end. And going back to the Céspedes, a case is made easier to understand because of the political problems that she had to begin with. In a way, when her literary career literally just started. This takes us to 1935, which, as you probably remember, is the year in which eventually by October we have the invasion of Ethiopia by fascist Italy. And what happened was that in February 1935, so a few months before, the Céspedes is arrested by the Italian police, and the accusation is that she has made a number of anti-fascist or anti-Italian comments through a telephone conversation, which is bizarre because if you think it, or better, not so much bizarre, but it makes you realize that obviously her phone must have been tapped by then, so there must have been already reasons why the Italian police were somehow tapping into the phone. And because of that, the Italian political police created a file on her, which was an open file that one can now go to the Italian State Archives in Rome and consult. And that gives you a sense of the way in which Her communications, her correspondence was monitored from then on. And this, at the start, probably there's a number of anonymous letters. Her file is full of anonymous letters arriving at the police, accusing her of being anti-fascist, accusing her of being amoral or immoral, and therefore there's a sense that before she emerged as a literary figure, she was already somehow perceived as a potential anti-fascist, as a woman that somehow was a little bit closer to anti-fascist, too close to anti-fascist circles. And then what happens is that then, sorry, I'm just putting my timer on so I can make sure I stay within my 15 minutes, because as you can see, I have a tendency to go off a tangent. But let's move straight to the novel, because then what happens is that the novel comes out, as Carolina was saying, published by Mondadori in December 1938. Mondadori was then the biggest publisher in Italy, was one probably the closest to the regime, because Arnoldo Mondadori had been supporting Mussolini from 1919. The first publications, actually, the posters of the when fascism was still a so-called movement in 1919 were actually published by Mondadori. So Mussolini considered Mondadori a kind of a faithful, somehow, supporter of the regime, and Mondadori very much used this kind of direct channel that he had with Mussolini in order to make sure that all his publications would be, in a way, smoothly published, with encountering as little problems in censorship as possible. And this is important because Mondadori was very influential. But more than that, there's also the sense that Mondadori had identified De Céspedes as a very promising female author. Because we can see that from the publicity campaign that Mondadori put together in October, November of 1938. Because remember, the book came out in December, and December was the peak in those years of the kind of publishing campaign of any publisher, because the Christmas sales were by far the biggest kind of sales that the publishers could dream of. And the fact that Mondadori kind of concentrated on De Céspedes gives a sense of how clear in Mondadori's mind was the value of the novel of Nessuno, torna, indietro. And indeed, it was a big success. The novel comes out, and just to give you a few figures, it had 12 reprints in 1939, and then another 7 in 1940. So, and remember, in those years, I remember Mondadori said that it was a lot if an Italian book sold between 5,000 and 10,000 copies. And within a few months, De Céspedes had already gone well beyond. So she was definitely a good choice on the part of Mondadori, and already an established, promising novelist. And indeed, the reviews as well acknowledged the sophistication of De Céspedes' work, even within fascist circles. And I just mentioned Il Popolo d'Italia, who, as you probably know, was the official daily paper of the regime, owned by the Mussolini family. And Nessuno, torna, indietro was reviewed by Villarroel, who was the in-house literary critic for the daily, who wrote a very, very positive review of the novel in March 1939. So everything seems to be going really well. So the beginning, the debut of the novel was a very successful one. As far as censorship is concerned, we only know that by December 1940, so literally almost 2 years into the publication of the novel, there was a request by the Ministry of Popular Culture to change, which was typical at the time, to change the courtesy form from lei to voi. I don't know, as you probably might have read, one of the sort of hobby horses of the fascist regime was to kind of have as virile a language as possible. So the idea was made that linguistically the voi was sort of more Italian, and therefore even novels had to reflect this. And so that was something that was actually done across the board. So there was nothing specific about Nessuno, torna, indietro. But then what happens is that things seem to be changed literally at the end of 1940. And by that time, De Céspedes published a collection of short stories, which was called Fuga, again published by Mondadori. And De Céspedes made the mistake of sending a copy to Mussolini himself, which gives a sense of the way in which probably I would be quite sure, although it is not documented, that the idea came from Mondadori, because Mondadori, as I said before, wanted to constantly keep this kind of channel open with Mussolini. So he probably told her to send a copy of Fuga to Mussolini. But what's interesting is that what we see from the paperwork coming from the Mussolini's office is that apparently he read a short story of the book. And then, and this is literally a note by his personal secretary saying, I read the story and it confirms that she's a good but immoral writer. And that is the beginning of the end, because at that point, and this is again gives you a sense of how censorship worked in those years. Mussolini thought of himself as very much, the judge of everything in Italy. He was the prime censor. And if Mussolini said anything negative about an author, that immediately cascaded within the system, and there would be all sort of initiatives being taken to somehow follow Mussolini's idea. And in this case, this seems to be what happened, because what's interesting is that literally a month after this note by Mussolini, we know that Mondadori was told by the Ministry of Popular Culture to stop the circulation of the novel, specifically saying following orders by the Duce. So what happens is that at that point, the novel theoretically is out of circulation. But again, what we know, particularly if you look at the access holdings of libraries libraries in Italy, you get a sense that actually Mondadori, which by the way he did it all the time, he basically did not follow the order. The book was circulated anyway. We can find reprints going all the way into the end of 1941. So there's no doubt that there was a decision to somehow stop the novel, which Mondadori did not follow. But then complications add with the arrival of the film adaptation, because by 1941, Mondadori has also come to the conclusion that actually a film could be made out of the book. And Mondadori, by that, had actually created his own film production company, which was called Montedoro, which is almost like a pun on Mondadori. And the idea was that the film was going to be produced, that the cast was going to be one of the most important, was going to involve some of the best actors in Italy at the time, in particular Doris Duranti, who at that time was one of the big divas of Italian cinema. She was supposed, and she did play the part of Emanuela in the film. But then what we see, and this literally takes place throughout 1941, is that anonymous letters against De Céspedes keep on arriving, and there's all sorts of accusations against her. And that keeps on triggering some censorship kind of moves on the part of the ministry, because by August 1941, there's a velina being sent to all the editors of Italian dailies. Velina, as you know, were those kind of orders sent by telegrams to all the editors, in which literally the regime told newspapers editors what could and could not be published. And this velina specified that all papers were told not to speak at all about the Céspedes' work. So there was a real ban on any critical writings on her. So there's a sense that as a literary figure, she's more and more marginalized, and it seems to be coming literally from the top. as if Mussolini at some stage had decided that she had to be marginalized. But what's interesting is that the film production actually goes ahead, and the Céspedes is involved, and she actually once again writes to Mussolini himself. So it's interesting to see how the Céspedes was aware of the fact that she needed, in order to get things going, she needed to literally get to the top and communicate to Mussolini. And eventually, because what happened was that because the book had been officially taken out of circulation, theoretically the film production had to stop as well. But she wrote by offering to literally change the title of the film, taking the title away from Nessuno, torna, indietro, so in a way breaking the connection between novel and film, and offering to new titles, mostly taken from the translations of the novel. Because, by the way, the novel was actually translated in 34 different countries. It was a global success. It wasn't just a success in Italy. And interestingly enough, and once again, we've got a note from the archives showing that once again, it was Mussolini's decision to accept one of the many variations of very alternatives that the Céspedes had given as the new title, which was Pensione Grimaldi, which was the name of the boarding house where the novel is set. And so the production went ahead. But what's interesting is that there's almost seemed to be two different things going on. The production goes ahead, she's involved, and the film actually is shot, but the problem is that it's not circulated in 1943 when eventually it's ready, because in June 1943, the Mondadori production company folds, and so the distribution is stopped, and the film will only come out in 1945, and there's a whole stories about, again, the censorship that kind of took place post-war. But what's interesting is that while the film was going ahead, and one is get a sense that perhaps, once again, Mondadori's influence was part of it, the career of the Céspedes was entirely ruined. She was, in a way, she disappeared. She became invisible as a fiction writer because there were no more critical writings about her. But what's interesting, again, we know from the archives that she was also excluded from being a journalist. Again, through Mondadori, she was asked to work as a correspondent in France for Tempo. Tempo was an illustrated magazine very much built around the model of Life magazine, and very successful, very popular. The Céspedes was supposed to work for them, but when she asked for a passport to be renewed, the paperwork went all the way to the Ministry of Interior, and who was the head of the Ministry of the Interior at the time? Mussolini himself, because he held that ministry as well. And the application was rejected, so she was not allowed to go to France, and hence, literally, it's not surprising that as soon as the regime imploded in July 1943, that the Céspedes decided immediately to kind of try and move south and join the part of Italy which was then already been liberated and freed by the Allied forces, because literally this is an example of a woman's literary career that had been entirely stifled, entirely destroyed by the regime. And not because she was a militant anti-fascist, because in a way she never actually did anything specifically against the regime, but simply because she was identified as a woman author that somehow, a woman writer that somehow was, too far away from what the regime expected from a woman as an author, and also from novels about women in Italy, particularly in those last years of the 1930s. And that's more or less I think I've gone already beyond my 15 minutes, so I apologize. but I just want to give a bit of an overview of the way in which the regime somehow managed to literally stifle and suffocate the career of a woman writer, despite the fact that, as I was saying, she was, Nessuno, torna, indietro was recognized not just in Italy, internationally as a great novel. And here I stop. So thank you.
No, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Bonsaver, for this really interesting presentation and reconstruction of these dynamics of publication, also the relationship between literature and cinema under fascism. I really hope there will be time during the discussion to delve deeper into these topics. Thank you again. Now I would like to pass the floor to our second speaker, Professor Sabina Ciminari. Sabina Ciminari is maîtresse de conférence at the Université Paul-Valéry Montpellier 3, where she currently heads the Department of Italian Studies. Trained as a contemporary historian, she dedicates her research to women's writings, particularly Sibilla Leramo, Alba De Céspedes, Gianna Manzini, Milana Milani, and Elsa Morante, with a focus on editorial history, correspondences, and their archives. She also worked on Italian fiction of the 80s, self-translation, and as an Italianist in France, she has organized seminars and study days dedicated to the theme of teaching Italian language and culture abroad. Among her latest works are the monograph Lettere all'editore, Alba De Céspedes e Gianna Manzini, autrici mondadori, and the edited volume with Silvia Contarini, Alba De Céspedes e gli anni francesi. With this presentation, we delve into a later phase of De Céspedes' trajectory, shifting our focus to France, where her work has had and continues to have a very rich and interesting reception. The title of the presentation is From Best Read, Best-Selling Author to Jeune Auteur Français, Trajectories in France of Alba De Céspedes' works. Thank you very much, Professor Ciminari, for being here with us today, and I leave you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, which was a little painful for me due to my lack of command of English. I'm going to read, sorry about that, and I will okay, I think it's good now. No, perhaps just a moment. Yes.
Perfect.
But in fact,
Thank you.
This was precisely my reason for being interested in participating, because for me, these seminars are a unique opportunity to confront myself outside the confines of Italian studies in Italy and in France. And if there is one writer who deserves this transnational attention, it is Alba De Céspedes, as she's read today in the world, in the sense that, to my knowledge, few other women writers pose the problem of a national belonging and recognition like Alba De Céspedes. And at the same time, they find a way around it by choosing an international perspective in which the concepts of literary language, homeland, self-exile are combined in such a personal and original way. Without prejudice to this richness and problematic starting point, where the concepts of mother tongue and second language also and particular declinations, I find it useful to take advantage of this opportunity to introduce you, first of all, to the stages of my interest in the figure of Alba De Céspedes in France. Here I'm giving you a summary of my publications on the subject, starting with the last work, which I edited with Silvia Contarini, back to the first essays about the self-translation, of her last published works. Second, to tell you which Alba De Céspedes is read and known in France today. This will be our starting point. As you can see at the moment, 2 works of Alba De Céspedes are available in France. The translation of Dalla parte di lei, already available in paperbacks, and that of Quaderno Proibito. I submit 2 reflections, starting with this fact. The first is that everything was possible, and here the title of your seminar series seems to me to be particularly pertinent, thanks to Elena Ferrante. A glance at the publisher's website is enough to confirm this. Imagine an Elena Ferrante who had fallen completely into oblivion in the first. Second, Elle is also a magnificent manifesto of freedom for all women, a classic published in Italy, recommended by Elena Ferrante. In fact, in France, the publisher's revival corresponds to the renewed interest in Alba De Céspedes coming from the Anglo-Saxon world, and the project carried out between 2023 and 2024 to translate into English Dalla parte di lei and Quaderno Proibito. Projects, in a certain sense, triggered by the interest declared towards this writer by Elena Ferrante, who described their pages as dazzling and her work as of great literary intelligence. An author inscribed in the world literature who thus allows a writer of an earlier generation to make the same transition and to move from forgotten to classic status. Second point, what is happening today mirrors what happened in the past when Alba De Céspedes was received in France and only began her penetration into French-speaking countries after the success of the translation of Dalla parte di lei in the US under the title The Best of Husbands. 70 years later, therefore, the mechanism seem to be the same, and the fact is surprising. There remains to be investigated, to my knowledge, the reason for the lack of penetration in France of what was nevertheless her greatest success abroad, Nessuno, torna indietro. Her first novel that consecrated her as a successful debut author, and that in the end contributed to her being labeled the most read, most sold author, as De Céspedes recalls, and as I wanted to express in the title of my communication, a label that for her, so she writes to her editor, would have created a poor model. As you can see here, De Céspedes only penetrate in France in the 1950s, and in a reverse order to the original. First, Dalla parte di lei, then Quaderno Proibito, now respected by Gallimard. Not only that, this inverted debut would mark her physiognomy in France. On the one hand, De Céspedes is tied to a single publisher with whom she has as a privileged relationship, so strong that over the years she has come to recognize him as her publisher par excellence, someone whose voice is indispensable to her to replace that of her Italian publisher, Arnoldo Mondadori. In France, the writer is identified with Les Seuils and also contributes to the success of this publishing house. Elle was one of the publishing House's greatest success, published in the 10,000 copies, a considerable number in 1956, and contribute to the reconstruction of the publishing house in the 50s. On the other hand, De Céspedes is known well after the resistance. In Italy, in the cultural and literary context of the time, she was, after all, a figure of a writer who identified with the anti-fascism resistance, and thanks to her commitment in Free Italy and in the immediate post-war period, where she was an animator of Salon and director of one of the most important magazines of Free Italy. At the time, however, we feel it is important to emphasize the fact that her production certainly brought back into the Italian national cultural sphere seemed at the same time to be set in a national literary context such as the French one, where the comparison could have been none other than Flaubert. Alessandra is presented as a nouvelle Madame Bovary, whereas for Cahiers Interdit, the reading is placed, therefore, in the concept of the more general liberation of women. The translation of the later works corresponds to another phase of the publishing penetration in France, a phase that, with the transition from one translator, Juliette Bertrand, to another translator, Louis Bonalumi, enables us to follow the stages of a progressive awareness of the complexity of the translation process, and therefore of the choice of an increasingly marked intervention in the quality of the transposition of her works into French. De Céspedes, in fact, had either to concentrate essentially on cuts for English translation. Now, this interest in the guise that their works take in the various countries in which they are disseminated can become systematic, particularly on the English and French versions considered to be more vehicular than others. What prompted to this change? The triggering fact seems to have been the discovery of numerous inaccuracies in the 1958 translation of Prima e Dopo, which she reviews in a veritable cahier de doléances that she addressed to the publisher, and which prompted her to request the inclusion of an errata corrige in the French edition of the novel. De Céspedes, moreover, it is worth remembering, could read French fluently, because this language basically corresponded to the language of her family, and insofar as her parents, the Italian Laura Bertini and the Cuban Carlos Manuel de Céspedes y Quesada, communicated in this language. And it was in France that the writer spent a large part of her childhood with her paternal aunt during the long period of absence of her parents, which followed her father's diplomatic commitments. A language of her origins, therefore French, which is now becoming increasingly popular, thanks also to the success of her works in France. So all her works from this point onwards are conceived in parallel for two countries. And they also offer the writer the opportunity to reread herself, to reflect again on her works, and in some cases, to make adaptation, modifications, a field that of the editorial philology of printed texts that, in the case of Alba De Céspedes, has yet to bear fruit. Thus, in Journée d'août, the translation of the collection in 1962, only 12 short stories are contained from the 1955 collection, which numbered 18. The book of the turning point and of the choice of the gradual move to the French area is Il Rimorso, a novel that becomes more successful in France than in Italy, which is largely composed during one of her long stays in France and which is subjected to numerous microcuts. See the editorial advertisement on this slide, which reviews for the Italian public the critical success of the novel in France. And above all, the worth of an internal Mondadori report where the question is asked of the difference in reception between France and Italy. She notes that one of the reasons for its Transalpine success are partly given by the points of contact it seems to have with novels such as Simone de Beauvoir's The Mandarin, and the fact that it seems to be written, and I quote, for a French rather than an Italian audience. This is perhaps when Alba De Céspedes chooses her side and to inscribe herself in another literary canon, the French one, more than in the one in which she had been read until then. The confirmation would seem to come from her latest work, but in our opinion, the matter is decidedly more complex. Against the backdrop of this editorial transition, which allows Alba De Céspedes to move from collection dedicated to translation to collection dedicated to French writers, there are in fact other aspects which can biographical, intellectual, that seem to complicate her position.
Professoressa, mi scusi se la interrompo, le chiedo giusto di avviarsi alla conclusione per lasciare spazio poi anche alla sua collega. Grazie mille.
In fact, De Céspedes was living permanently in France at that time, although she kept the door to Italy open until at least 1974. Yet her relationship with France will never assume the character of a complete adhesion of the choice of a country capable of replacing the country of her birth, Italy. France will always be a host country, the country in which she chooses to live and work. France will never be a homeland for her, just as Italy may not have been either, because if there is one place to which she feels affectively attached, and even more strongly after the Castro Revolution, that is Cuba. It is not surprising, therefore, that Cuba is in the background, also present in his first work in French, the Chansons de Filles de Mai, and in the second, Sans autre lieu que la nuit. A book, very experimental novel, Alba De Céspedes imagine call a petition to obtain signatures in favor of the liberation of the young Daniel Launay in Brazil. But the background, there is nothing more than the commitment of Anne-Philippe and Alba De Céspedes in favor of the then young communist Régis Debray, a friend of Castro's. But this is another story, a story that will launch De Céspedes into the work of her last lonely decades of life, committed to a novel with which she seems to want to make a further transition from French writer to a writer committed to her tribute of love to Cuba, the only country for which she will say she's willing to die. The French parable thus gives way to another chapter, and I in turn give way to my colleague. Thank you for your attention, and sorry for my pronunciation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Ciminari, for your presentation and also for your linguistic effort. So thank you very much.